Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the final session in the Be Ready to Play series in association with UPMC. This evening's session is titled Translating the Analysis to the Pitch, and we are very fortunate to be joined by Kevin McGuigan and Colin Clear. Kevin currently works as the performance analyst with Sports NI Sports Institute, working across a number of sports supporting coaches and athletes competing at an elite level. His most recent task has seen him deliver remote support to Team Ireland at the Tokyo Olympics. In particular, to the analysis working with the ladies hockey team, badminton and the track cycling team. He has also spent the past 3 seasons as the lead analyst with Down senior football team and continues to manage the National Video Sharing Project, coordinating the sharing of match footage between all 32 counties competing in the National Football League. Kevin currently has 2 published academic articles in Gaelic football, the first in 2018 focusing on KPIs in club Gaelic football, and the second earlier this year identifying the scoring zone in inter-county Gaelic football. Colin Clear is Learning and Development Manager for Leinster GAA. He is Level 2 Certified GAA Coach, as well as being a qualified GAA tutor since 2010 and a GAA tutor trainer since 2014. He completed an MSc in Sports Performance Analysis in 2016 and is involved in coaching groups from nursery right through to adult level. So I'll now hand you over to Colin, who will begin the session on translating the analysis to the pitch. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks, James, for that introduction. We're delighted to be here with you guys this evening. So there's both myself and Kevin that'll be talking you through this translating the analysis to the pitch. What we hope to do as part of this discussion, this webinar on the Be Ready to Play program, is to have a conversation more so than a presentation, and we're going to discuss some of our views and our opinions, and again some of the experience we'd have in relation to performance analysis and how we'd see it maybe hopefully benefiting people in relation to translating what they're analysing and bringing it towards the pitch. Before we really get into some examples, which we're going to be discussing this evening, there's 3 things that we'd like to just maybe highlight as key things that we feel are important in relation to that sort of practical application of analysis. So the first element we'd like to talk about is the clarity of purpose and the importance that has in relation to analysis. So if as a coaching team, and that includes the analyst with you, as part of that coaching team, if there isn't clarity on what exactly you're looking to do, then that is going to lead to problems down the road. That's going to lead to confusion, not just among yourselves and how you're communicating to the players and what you're looking for from the players, but also their understanding of what it is you're trying to do. So having that conversation, teasing it out, challenging each other, and to be clear on what are those maybe 3, 4 or 5 key things that you feel as a group is going to have the biggest impact on performance, and then finding ways to measure that and analyze that and feed it into your training program. So we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail as we go through the session. But that clarity of purpose and the clarity of what it is you're looking to do is a key element of the analysis process. The second thing, for those who would have seen the presentation with the previous one with Denise, and it was
Brian McClelland, I think
Brian McClelland was involved in it as well. Yeah, so Denise and Brian, they would have shared this image with you. And what we see this is, it's anything you do measure, anything you do analyze, it only really becomes beneficial if it's actionable. If you can take that information and you can use it, whether that's in-game or post-game, in order to affect your future training sessions. So whatever you're looking at, the first thing you're trying to figure out is the facts, what's happening, whether that's quantitative or qualitative. Then you're looking at that information and you're deciding what was the cause, why did it happen? Looking at the effect if you change things, and then feed into the coaching process. Do you act or do you not act? What's the impact of it? And again, within the tight time frame we have of club championships, especially in this COVID period where things are going to be condensed, we can't act on everything. So it's about prioritizing and deciding what is the important stuff. So again, we'll tease that out a little bit as we go through our examples in a while. And this last one is, I think, really important for us as coaches, as analysts, is just because you can measure something doesn't mean it's actually what you need to look at. So not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So what we're looking at there is, people throw out this term paralysis by analysis. If you end up looking and try to get a bit of everything and look for everything, yes, you'll get lost. You won't see the wood from the trees. But what you have to ask yourself is, what's important and what is going to have the biggest impact for you as a group of coaches, and then as a group of players. And within that, you then have to find a way to try and measure it, to try and analyze it in order to have the biggest impact. So we're going to tease out a little bit in relation to how that works and fits in the coaching process. Kevin, I might just come over to yourself. Is there anything you want to add on the three of them before we go any further?
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, look, I think a lot of the stuff around the clarity it's so pertinent these days. From my experience, it's so often whenever you go in, if analysis is new to a coach or a coaching team, the tendency will be to want everything. So just looking at the slide that you have on now, they'll ask for everything. And I suppose for coaches to be aware that an analyst probably operating on their own isn't going to be able to measure everything. And certainly if they are going to try and do it, it's not going to be as accurate as you want it to be, or maybe you won't have the depth or richness of information as you need. So it really is important to look at what are the important things. Now, it might take a bit of trial and error, to get to the important things for your team and your setup, but I think it's important to go through that process and include the analyst within those conversations in the coaching setup. And then whenever that has happened, I suppose the very first slide had the idea about clarity and confusion. I've had experience in the past where you get to half-time in a game and the agreement at the start has been, I'm just recording the number of turnovers, that's it, no more information, no more depth. And whenever you come in, you have one of the coaches asking, but who's turning it over, or where are we turning it over? And this stuff has never been agreed, so I don't have the information. And then it starts to develop a bit of confusion and a bit of, I suppose, a few problems within the analysis setup. So I think just looking at those slides, it's an absolute must for a first go-to, that you get clarity there and you really nail down what it is you're looking at, and everyone has that understanding of what is being collected and what's not being collected. And to avoid those questions, or those awkward questions where an analyst is having to sit and say, I don't know. Because I know as an analyst, you never feel good whenever you can't give information that's being asked, but being fair to an analyst, you can't expect them to collect everything. Certainly not accurately anyway.
Very good. Thanks, Kevin. So what we're going to do is we're just going to tease out some practical examples of what this actually looks like in a club setting, and whether that's a minor, it could be under 20 or a senior. That's sort of where we're going to be pitching it at today, of that sort of level. One of the examples I'm going to take straight out first of all, and we'll use this meaningful element, is a lot of us will be measuring puck outs or kick outs, and one of the things we generally look at is we look at the count, and we look at the ones we've retained or lost, whether that's clean, broken. We might have analysed where on the pitch, whether it's short, medium or long. So we're just going to take a practical example and we'll put it in a hurling context to begin with, or camogie context, and we'll just take the two examples of a short puck out and a long puck out. So if we take it where the action is the puck out short, puck out long, and we'll just, for easiness sake, take it that there was 10 of each, a total count of 10 of each. And within that then, the retained possession, so of the short, we retain 10 of them. So that's 100% retention. That's all fine, well and good. And on the puck out long, we've retained 5 of them, so we've 50% retention. The next thing we're adding a little bit maybe more detail on it is what was the outcome of that, the number of shots. So if we take the number of shots here from the short puck out, we got 3 out of the ones we retained. So that's a 30% from the balls we've retained. And again, we retained 100% of them. On the puck out long, again, we turn out with 3 shots, but we've done that out of 5 possessions that we've retained. So that's 60%. So again, even enough, and looking at that in that context, 3 shots from the short, 3 shots from the long. Now, if we apply that and stop at that level and go, right, we've just analysed our puck out retention and what is the outcomes of the ones we retained. Does that give us enough information to make it actionable? And is it what really counts? Because we've actually got 7 puck out short that we don't know what happened to them, and we've got 7 puck out long that we don't know what happened. What was the outcome of those? We know from the long, we know we've lost 5 of them. The opposition won them from the puck out. We never gained possession. And of the puck out short, there's 7 of them where we won possession, but we didn't get a shot away. So what actually happened? So we want to really measure what counts. And if we feel that that is something that's important as a coaching team, so the clarity here, if we refer back to the clarity is, as a coaching team, we want to know what happens when from our puck outs, whether that's puck out short, which is more efficient, or the puck out long, and what comes of it. So if we took a very simple template like this, a notational template that we were doing in game, and as you can see, there's the 10 puck outs short on the left hand side, and if we take the 10 that went long on the right, simple coding system of plus being the green plus are the ones that we got a shot from, the orange minus is the neutral where that phase of play ended, and the red X is the opposition got a shot off. So in simple terms, this changes the outcome of our puck outs by looking at it and analysing it at this level, because as you can see on the left hand side there, we did get the 3 shots off from the short puck outs, where 2 to the right, 1 to the left. But actually, of those possessions, we were turned over. Of those 10 that we won, we were turned over maybe 3 times, which resulted in a shot to the opposition. If we look at the long ones, yes, we only retained 5. But of that, we got 3 from our own where we retained it. But perhaps we turned over the opposition with 1 that they won, and we get a shot off. So actually, from that, we got 4 shots off, and we had 1 against us. So now we have a 4-1 versus a 3-3. That would impact on the decision making we have in game, whether we go for long puck outs or short puck outs. But it's that extra bit of information. Now we're measuring what counts, not just whether we won or lost the puck out, because how important is that in the greater scheme of things? Anything you want to add in there, Kevin?
Yeah, a brilliant example, Colin. And you know, I've recent experience of something similar in football. Team that I was working with, we were struggling on kickouts, and you know, it wasn't a secret of the fact we were struggling on kickouts, and there was a very predictable kickout setup that we would have gone to, and it came in for a lot of criticism as to why did they keep coming back to this, why did they keep persisting with it. But there were underlying figures and underlying numbers as to why we continued to do it. When we set up the particular kickout, we were set up very solidly from a defensive point of view, and as it turned out, over 7 or 8 games, I think we'd only conceded 1 score off taking that kick out. So we might only have a 50% success rate in terms of winning possession from it, but we only actually conceded 1 score off the possessions that we lost. And it was because of how we set up. When a team won the ball, we had enough players on the defensive side of the ball to get pressure on, and be set up very, very rigidly from a defensive perspective. So, you know, that side of things, adding that context or adding that extra layer of detail is so vital for actually informing what we're doing decision-wise. And just going slightly off piste on this as a caveat to that, the template that you have on the screen at the moment, really, really good example and something that a lot of coaches could try and take and try and adapt. The only one thing, and it's for probably a bit of caution on it, be very cautious about asking analysts to do this in terms of the time that you're asking them to gather this stuff. We have to remember that every puck out, there could be a 20 or 30 second phase of play after it, where that analyst is then still going to have to retain the information as to, right, what is happening here. And there may be other things going on that they also need to record. So while it looks like a nice simple template, if you have a single analyst operating on their own on a wet day with no cover, it can be difficult enough to try and gather all the stuff. So it's a nice to have. Is it the absolute essential? It probably is, in my opinion, but just making sure that the analyst is comfortable with gathering that as well as whatever else you want them to gather.
And I think, Kevin, that's the key point, and you've nailed it there really well, is if we're looking for a bit of everything, we can't do anything right. So that comes back to your clarity and measuring what counts. So decide as a coaching team, you'll actually, if this is going to be really important, maybe that's the only thing we measure because we've only one analyst and this is what we want them to look after, because it's something we can't observe real time, or the phase of play will move on and we'll be distracted as a coaching team, where the analyst can focus on this. If you have 2 or 3, then you can maybe look at 2 or 3 things, but cut your cloth to measure and prioritize what is important for you as a team in order to be actionable. Yep. There's all this having nice information, but if you turn around and said the puck outs was we've won 60% of our puck outs or 70% of our kick outs at halftime, what are you going to do about that? What action can you take? How can you change that if you don't have any detail behind it in order to make decisions?
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good point. The next thing then, if we're talking about transferring this back then to a training pitch, so we've got this information, we've had it live in game, maybe we've made a couple of decisions. If we come back to the original figures, now as a coaching team, we have to decide which is it we're going after. Are we going after to try and increase these number of shots from the short puck outs because we are retaining 100, and can we get that to 4 or 5 and increase that and not be turned over on the way out? Is that what we're going to work on in training? Or perhaps do we look at retaining more of our long puck outs? If we can get that to 6 or 7, the percentage is high. So do we go after trying to get more shots off that way? And that's then what feeds back into your decision-making process as a coaching team. The numbers aren't going to give you the answers. You look at the video afterwards, if you've got it, and ideally that's what you need is the numbers, which allows you to ask better questions. Look at the video, and then as a coaching team, which is it are you going to put the time and effort, especially if you've only a week maybe into the next game? Can you do both? Probably not. Which is it you're going to work on in order to try and improve your chances of getting more shots away? Do you work on that short one and retaining it and getting more away that way, or actually winning that initial ball, or maybe turning over the opposition further up the field if they do win it? And that's how it feeds back into your coaching practice.
Yeah, Colin, just to back that up, like I think what you have on the screen there are they're really informative headline numbers, and that's what they are. They're headline numbers. There's always more behind that. And Johnny Bradley is a great one for the phrase always being curious, and you always want to be curious about what is behind each number, and that's where if you have the benefit of video, it's efficiency when you're doing that. So you can very quickly navigate through the video to those issues, to those puck outs, and have a look and see right what's going on behind them. And it might be there's a pattern with where, or there's a pattern with how, or a pattern with who. And instead of maybe doing a session that involves a whole panel, you might be able to identify, you know what, we only actually need to work with these 3 players. Because if these 3 players can win us 1 or 2 more possessions on those long ones, then we're going to be in a far better place. So I think the headline numbers are brilliant for trying to make your sessions and also make your analysis before the session even more efficient with trying to nail down exactly what the finer problem is.
Yeah, I think that's so true. It just allows you to ask better questions and then look at the video and isolate it in a little bit more detail. And I think that feeds in nice to another example I'd have from my own experience as well, Kevin, is we'll say there was a team I was working with, and one of the things they were measuring was basically the ball retention in the scoring zone in a hurling context. Now, what's the scoring zone in a hurling context? Again, that can be unique to individual players. But in this case, they were looking at the inside forward line. So any balls retained inside the 45 from those 3 players. Now, the message from the coaches, which was, again, I think something a lot of us would have, we want you to continuously make runs and we want you to be looking for the ball and be in the best position for the ball when it does come in. So that was the message to the 3 inside forwards. Again, no different than I'd say a lot of coaches would have. But the retention and the numbers were quite low. I think it was down at around 25 or 30%, even though they were playing 3 inside. And it was right, there's something up here, the ball's going in. So the retention, the number was low, but what was the reason? What was the why? And what they decided to do as a coaching, what we decided to do was we put a camera on the forwards, on that inside forward, just on that end of the pitch, nice and easy, wide angle. And we looked at the movement for about 20 seconds before every ball was played in. And the lads, the inside forwards, were all making fantastic runs. It wasn't the first run they were making, it was the second and the third. But the 3 players were all converging on the ball at the same time, so ultimately bringing the defenders in. So you had 3 forwards, 3 attackers moving to where the ball was being played. That was doing what the coaches had ultimately asked them to do, look for the ball and be in the right place. And what we done was we actually just pulled up the clips and showed them to the 3 inside forwards. And it was, lads, look at this, have a look at this, let's tease this out. And after the first one, it was, yeah, maybe. second, third, and suddenly they were looking at each other going, what are we doing here? We're all running to the ball. So the clarity of message from the coaches changed as well. They had looked at it and it was, right, as an inside forward unit, our job now is not to always be running and always be in the right position for the ball. Our job now is to try and be always running and get one of us in the right position for the ball. So about creating space for others. So that changed the message from the coaches and also the players. And the players looked at the video, and in the next coaching session that took place, the next couple, it was basically put up to them to find ways to create space for each other and ensure that there was only one. The follow-up measurement was the next game, camera on the forwards again, and ideally one of them was making a run to the ball where the other two were clearing out and creating space. And that was how that impacted in a practical way, from taking the headline number, digging into the why. The deliveries in was decent, but it was the three of them were trying to do the right thing, but ended up getting in each other's way by doing so. So just an example of what Kevin was talking about.
Yeah, Colin, I think that's a really good example, actually, and it highlights the power of the video as well. You know, that number of 25% ball retained inside, if you throw that out to the three inside forwards, they're probably, no doubt, human nature will be to point the finger at the ball in, point the finger at everything else, the referee, whatever other excuse they can look for. And I'm not saying the guys are excuse makers, but the point being, we'll always look for reasons as to why. But to put the video on and to actually show people very, very clearly, apart from taking out that opportunity to, you know, to look at other reasons for it, it actually highlights what they could be doing differently as well. Because you can probably see in those videos, you could probably see the spaces that were being left, you know, where one of them could be taking another defender out to. And yeah, look, the power of video, thankfully, from my point of view, thankfully it's increasing in terms of how much we're using it, especially down at club level. But in terms of the power of it and what we're trying to do with it, I think that's a really good example of something that is easily actionable even at club level, where you can put a video on just one area of the pitch to look at certain players and certain movements.
And I think that's key, is as a coach and team, if that's something you want to work on, find a solution, find a way to analyze it, whether that's, and ideally it's both maybe quantifiable as well as you've getting the quality in the video and being able to look at the why as well. So the what and the why, if you can combine that in your measurements, I think you'll go a long way to achieving what you're looking to do. The third example I'm going to give before, Kev, I'll let you throw in some of your own examples, is it links back to a personal one as well. And again, my background is within coach education and all of that. Is there's always this discussion about, we'll say, the positivity side of things and being able to give feedback in a constructive way, etc. But one of the things we can do is, it's our language and how we approach things. So if we take the analysis, and the example I'm going to give here is one of the figures a lot of us would use would be shot efficiency. So if we take shot efficiency as an example of something we're looking for, and again, feeding back into the conversation we have, the number itself is one thing, but then you need the video to understand why is the efficiency. They might have been shooting from the right places on any other day, they'd go over. It could be just that given day. There might be technical issues. It could be shot selection, so the location, they could be shooting under pressure. There's a lot to feed into it, but that high level number can be hugely important as well if we look at it as what it takes to win, and what it takes to win, whether that's at minor level in your own county, at senior level in your county. What is the shot efficiency on average for winning teams in that championship? If you can start with that baseline figure and then look at it and bring that into your feedback at half time. So the example I'm going to give is, a couple of years ago, I was doing a little bit of research on the hurling side of things, and it's going back a few years, and I know the efficiency has changed, but the example still sits, whereby in 2015, the Senior All-Ireland Inter-County Championship shot efficiency was about 56%. And that's the following year in 2016, Kilkenny drew with Waterford in the All-Ireland semi-final. And Austin Gleeson was interviewed by Joanne Cantwell, and she asked the question, she said, "You'd 18 wides today. Is that something you're going to work on for the next day?" And Austin's response immediately was actually, "No, that's about where we need it to be." So that was a clear message within that team that actually wide count, yes, efficiency is potentially important, but if they had 18 wides, They scored 121 or 122 that day, I think it was. So their efficiency was above that 55, 56%. They were getting the shots away. So no doubt that wasn't mentioned in the dressing room. Where how often would underage teams or club teams do we go in and we might have 10 wides? And if we take the hurling context again, we had 10 wides and we may cut down on wides. Even though you might have scored 110 or 111 and you're putting a focus on the wides, you'll actually, if your efficiency is there where it needs to be, you're telling players not to shoot, when in reality they're shooting and they're hitting the percentages and they're hitting the efficiency that needs be. So by focusing on something that's like the wides there, you're, as a coach or a coaching team, are focusing on potentially the wrong thing. And that's how to use numbers if you've got what's relevant for that team. Don't pull your senior inter-county figures, because they're not going to apply across the club level. And I know, Kevin, you've done a good bit of research on the club football and there's the comparison to inter-county and where it changes. So understand the level you're playing at. What are those high level figures of efficiency and stuff? And they can be used then as benchmarks in order to look at from a team and allow you to focus on what is important rather than getting distracted.
Yeah, Colin, I'm going to come in there because firstly, in terms of the research, I have a paper, it was 2018, where I actually looked at KPIs in club football, and it actually details, albeit it's Ulster Club Championship football it was based on, but it details shot success for senior, intermediate and junior club level teams. So it's something, as a reference point. I know a couple of teams that I've chatted to have ended up using it and referring to some of the stuff when they're looking at those numbers. But the idea of that relative number, so the number of scores relative to the number of shots, I think it's something that I think slowly we're getting a bit of traction on now, and we're starting to bring it in. The automatic, and look, I suppose from the point of view of the consumer, what you'll hear from commentators and analysts on any of the programs is usually about the wide counts. But you're completely right, from an analysis point of view and a coaching point of view, it's all about efficiency. Now, absolutely, if we go into a post-match session and we're looking to feedback and our shot success is down at 40%, we're absolutely looking at what's the breakdown of the 17 shots that we didn't score with. And if 15 of them were wides, then absolutely we have an issue with wides. But the first number you're looking at is that shot efficiency. That's, to me, that's just a great example of if you need to hit a certain percentage and you maintain a certain efficiency in your shooting, there's no problem with shooting the lights out and shooting and shooting and shooting. You can take 40, 50 shots in a match, but if your shot success is staying at that, whatever it happens to be, the 56%, I think was the example you used, if it's staying at that, then there's nothing wrong with shooting. You're going to accumulate more wides, but you're also going to accumulate more scores. So it's that relative number. And there's something similar in the feedback that I give. Most teams, even teams I work with, will still want a turnover count as a raw count. So by half time, tell us how many turnovers we have. We've got 16 turnovers. I now, and probably for a couple of years, have also been doing a number or a reading called turnover rate, and that is the number of turnovers relative to the number of possessions that the team has had. The reason I look at that, 16 turnovers, the example I've just thrown out, on a wet, cold night in the middle of January or February, 16 mightn't be too bad at halftime because it's a horrible day. It's early in the season, 16 isn't too bad. But if I'm turning around with that number in the middle of July in a championship match, all of a sudden that 16 is a completely different number. But if we're still looking at it relative to the number of possessions and the volume of possessions that the team have, there's probably a bit of consistency with how you're measuring it there. So just having those ideas of percentages and numbers relative to other numbers, I think gives a better comparison on a match-to-match basis, or even on a team-to-team basis whenever you're trying to do some interpretation of these numbers.
Yeah, I think that's very good. I might hand it over to you on this one, Kevin. This was a sample you were going to look at.
Yeah, so I've just a couple of examples, and it's more just things to trigger a couple of ideas and a bit of thinking. And firstly, the credit on this dashboard on the screen to Ben McGuckin. Ben's the analyst in Derry and has been for a number of years and doing brilliant work up there. But this is a dashboard he generates through his software, which, you know, it's massively informative, and has such a depth of information. Between this example and even the following example is one that I would use in Down. They produce the same information, they're just presented slightly differently. They look different. Big part of that is a coach. If a coach is looking at that, getting familiar with what they're looking at, so a coach will automatically be able to pick out the key numbers for them. I know Ben has done this as a general thing rather than working specifically with a team, which is why you have everything for both teams on that. But if a coach becomes familiar with what they're looking at, then they'll very quickly get to the numbers that they need to see. But I mean, what's on the screen, and as I said, the example to follow, one of the questions I would sort of always throw out is, how much is too much? You know, at what point are we starting to get too much information to actually be able to get any credible analysis out of it? And I've already referred to in-game, how much you're asking an analyst to do and what they're capable of doing. And I think getting that balance between what they're capable of and making sure that it's accurate, I think that's absolutely crucial. If it's an inexperienced analyst, start easier and start to add some stuff as you go. If you have an experienced analyst, I know we've had a number of conversations in the past. I know, Colm, you've been included in some of them. It's conversations we've had with Denise and Brian and even Johnny Bradley. And I have heard on occasions that coach is king, so the coach, whatever the coach wants, goes from an analysis perspective. And I was chatting to Brian McClelland earlier on today, and it was something that we both have began to think, to a point, yes, the coach is king in terms of how they want to play the game and that, but an experienced analyst is probably a really good sounding board for what you want to actually gather. Because I think what you'll find is a lot of analysts, especially guys who have been around the block a bit and are experienced, will have ways and means of collecting information that coaches want. So I think that conversation again between coach and analyst is so important, and taking the analyst view on board in terms of what you want to look at and what's important. Identifying the key numbers is probably, you know, it's part of that process as well, and it's not necessarily something that happens straight away. I think I've already alluded to that the easy go-to things are usually kickouts or puckouts, turnovers and shots. I know they're probably, from an analysis point of view, they're the three absolutely central things, but there are things that would be central to how a team wants to play a game. If you take the example of, you know, what are we winning on opposition kickouts? Yeah, I have experience in the past of a coach who was furious at the team because they hadn't won enough of the opposition kickouts. But whenever he actually reflected on what they were doing, they were dropping a player back to sweep. So they were giving them a free person up there to take the kickouts, and then complaining that we weren't winning enough. So you have to marry up what you're looking at in terms of your stats with the way you're trying to play the game. And accept that sometimes some of these key numbers are not going to be where you need them to be because of a tactical option that you're taking. And I think it's just something to keep in mind when we're looking at these and trying to do an in-depth analysis, trying to apply it to the pitch afterwards. You know, is there something we did tactically that led to that number, as opposed to players not executing a plan? If you just skip that on, Colm, just to the next example. So this is one that I would have done. It's actually the Down Club Championship last year. It's the championship final between Warrenpoint and Kilcoo. And within that, there are probably headline numbers right down on each side. So it's headline numbers for each figure. And the question I would raise now are headline figures enough? Now, if I was to go down through that list of numbers and to try to decipher what are the important things and what was the big difference, the one thing I would be looking at would probably be turnovers lost and then the turnover rate. So if we could see that both down towards the bottom there. So Warrenpoint had 10 more turnovers than Kilcoo did. And then when we look up to the shot count, they also had 11 fewer shots. So the turnovers were almost directly related then to the volume of shots, which is probably where the difference in the game was. Now, if I was to take that Warrenpoint team onto a training pitch on the Tuesday night, and we were armed with that information, would it be enough? You could argue, yes, we want to see far fewer turnovers within this session, but if we had access to the video, or we had access to another level of information, and we looked at those 23 turnovers, and we're able to establish how many of them were kick passes, how many of them were hand passes, how many were in the tackle, how many were unforced errors, how many were frees that we conceded through over carrying or anything like that. Break it down like that. Where on the pitch was it happening? Who was responsible? Maybe even what stage of the game was it? So, for example, were 7 of those in the last 5 minutes? Potentially when Warrenpoint were loading the square for goals and we're just kicking the ball in. But that level of information can give you so much more to work with. So if we think about this as the example with 23 turnovers, if we then break that down and discover 17 of these were kick passes, then we can go into training the following Tuesday night and we know, right, we're looking at turnovers via kick passes. And the session can be built around trying to avoid that, or trying to improve the kicking, or trying to understand the concept of where we're trying to play the kicks to. Okay, so yeah, looking at that example of the kick passes, it's easy to look at this one single match screenshot and say, right, this is definitely the issue. But I suppose one thing that it gets lost sometimes in analysis, and definitely when it comes to applying analysis to the pitch, we tend to get wrapped up in what happened in the last game. So it'd be easy for the Warrenpoint management to turn around and say, it's definitely turnovers. We'll have to address that. That's not necessarily their biggest issue. It was in that game, or it may have been in that game, but they have to remember they're playing the best team in the county in a county final. So that's going to have affected it. What's probably more valuable in the long term for Warrenpoint is starting to look at their profile over 5, 6, 7, 8 games. So if they're starting to look at their turnover count, and their turnover count was 23 in that game, but prior to that it was maybe 10, 11, 12, then it's not necessarily an issue. So that idea of a profile over a long term, I think, is just far more valuable if you can get the information and if you can get it together and pull it together really succinctly.
I think that's, Kevin, I think that's a fantastic point, in that sometimes we can be reactionary to one event, or, as you said, one game, and the numbers are out. And even if I go back to that example I had before earlier in the conversation about that inside forward line, if we're looking for the ball sticking and we're looking for 20, whatever it is, we're looking for 60% retention, and suddenly you decide to pull out, that they play a sweeper, or you're pulling out an extra man or something like that, and you look at that game and then you factor it into your figures, you've also got to put that into the profile and realize there was something tactically different about that game. So can we use that game as part of the profiling or not? And is it beneficial? We're measuring apples and oranges there because the context has changed. So, and something you said earlier is, if we are going to profile, like, one of the best tips I ever got was in the top left-hand corner, right-hand corner, put the weather. Put what the weather conditions are. Even get down to that little bit of detail, because if you go back after 3 or 4 games, will you remember strong wind that day, or etc.? So all of that can impact on it. And you're 100% right on the profile and looking at it over a pattern. But at the end of the day, we've also got to factor in, are we playing enough games to really get a profile? And does it stay similar enough? So we have to include that as part of our overall bigger picture. And I think the key to any figure or any number that we're using as part of our coaching, that we're feeding into our coaching process, is it's never going to give us the answer. The figure, the number, is just going to allow us to ask better questions of each other and of the players. If we've got the video, that helps in answering those questions or giving us that little bit more detail. But numbers in themselves will never give the answer, or I've yet to come across it. Maybe you have the perfect one on a number. It just gives better questions.
Colin, I completely agree with that. The numbers aren't going to, they're never going to give you the solution. And one thing that's so important, and this applies to every sport, it's not just Gaelic football, hurling, ladies football, camogie, it's every sport in the world. There's no magic number. You know, in no sport has anybody produced. The magic number is the top line in that screen at the moment. It's the score. You know, outside of that, you could hit every other KPI or supposed KPI that you're told that you have to hit, and you could still lose a game. You know, because the other team has absolutely shot the lights out and had a 95% shot success rate. There's an example a couple of years ago. Was it Carlow in the Leinster Championship? I think they had 16 shots out of 17 or something.
I actually did 100% that day. They didn't miss. They didn't miss one.
So
yeah.
Whoever has gone out to play against them in that match has probably, you know, had a nice statistical day, but they've been beaten by a complete freak result, or not a freak result. That's unfair on Carlow, but a freak number within their set of results. So, you know, to think that the stats and the numbers are going to give you the magic formula, they're not. And from a coaching perspective, to follow on from that, to think that one session is going to give you the solution to turning the ball over or winning more kickouts, it's not going to happen in one session. You know, very few problems are going to be addressed in one session, and it's probably one of the frustrations I have as an analyst, where you see, you know, our kick-out percentage is hovering around 60. We want to get it up to 70, 75. We do one training session on it that weekend with a better day with the kick-outs, and all of a sudden kick-outs aren't revisited again for another week or another 2 weeks until our kick-outs have dropped again. You know, and I think it's just something you see quite regularly, where it becomes it's almost reactive. We react on a Tuesday night at training to what happened at the weekend, instead of looking at the longer term. We need to keep working on these things.
Very good. Kevin, you mentioned something earlier about this idea of the coach is king, and you know, and the relationship with the analyst and where it sits. And just a bit, I think I'd like to bring that back up again, and just maybe to challenge ourselves as coaches and also challenge ourselves as analysts in that relationship and where that sits. And an example I'll give there is that, and it comes back to measure what counts, or counting what you can measure sort of concept, is that if we look at goalkeepers, and I'm not even going to get down the road of football goalkeepers and their role at the moment, because we know that's at a complete different level. But that concept of, if you mapped out as a coaching team, you know, what are the 3 or 4 key things you want from your goalkeeper? And as I said, that's changed in football a little bit now. But this idea of, if you had have asked it a little while ago, it would have been their ability, their distribution, whether that's from dead, you know, from kickouts, puckouts, or dead ball situations, and even in play, it could be their saving, their shots, their ability to shot stop. And then what generally comes in the top 3 is communication. So communication is there. And as an analyst and a coach, we might turn and say, "Oh, how do you measure that?" You know, so we'll focus on the others because it's easy to count retention from kickouts and all of that. But if you decide communication is one of the key attributes you want from your keeper, then our challenge as coaches, and work with your analysts and listen to them. You know, this is something they're thinking about. This is their expertise, their skill sets. Is try find ways in order to capture that. And like, a brilliant example I seen of that was in relation to, in challenge games, a GoPro stuck to the crossbar, and it was sitting there, so you had a full view of everything that was in front, and the communication, if you couldn't hear the keeper from the GoPro on the crossbar, you knew you had an issue with volume and their ability to communicate. But then that was analysed afterwards, and the keeper was brought into it, and there's a couple of defenders in front then as well. Like, the amount of, how often was he communicating, the clarity in the communication, the detail, was he making the player aware? And sometimes, move left, but no player's name, so who was moving left, and all of that sort of stuff. So it's quantifiable, but you could actually, you could quantify some of those measurements. How often do the players in front react? Is there clarity in it? So find a solution. That's our job as analysts. And that's our job as coaches. Ask the right questions. We have to try and find the solutions and measure what really counts.
Colin, just to back that up, probably with another bit of an example around something similar. One thing that you'll hear coaches quite a bit now talking about, they want to measure work rate, or work rate when we don't have the ball. So the question automatically has to be, how do we measure that? And I think there are discussions to be had there between analysts and coaches as to, right, well, what is purposeful measurement and what's just, you know, almost pointless, if you want to call it that. But to be fair, I like the idea of having some sort of measurement. I really have issues with what's valid and reliable. But I know I had a conversation, it was before I left my previous role with Ulster GA, and I had a conversation with some of the coaches in there about it. And we talked about defensive actions per opposition pass or something like that. It was a concept that developed in Premier League football. And I raised it as this is a way of measuring work rate, and I get countered with, not everything has to be measured. And I'm sitting as an analyst thinking, yeah, but we may as well try and measure what we can. So that idea, it just throws around that idea of work rate and how do you do it. And I've experienced with some clubs that try to measure tackles, which opens another whole can of worms, in my opinion, as to what actually do we mean by a tackle? How do we define it? If a tackle is effective in that it stops a player, but he also gives away a foul, is it still an effective tackle? But these are all discussions to be had and to nail down as to what exactly counts. My biggest issue with the defensive actions and whether or not it can contribute to work rate is the most effective defender on the pitch might never need to tackle and might never need to touch the ball because they're covering space or they're covering runs and they're cutting out options for delivery into an inside forward line or whatever it may be. Yeah. And they might not be seen because the tendency for any analyst and any coach, probably 90% of the time, is to have their eyes on the ball or the immediate vicinity of the ball. And they're not necessarily looking at the defender who's cutting off all these options. So, yeah, I think this idea of measuring work rate you have to be very, very careful with, and how actions on the pitch can impact on that. You triggered that with that previous example. You just triggered that idea in my head, and it's something that I think is quite pertinent because I hear it quite a lot from coaches that they want to start measuring it, but don't really seem to. And I'm not saying analysts have the answer to it because we don't, but it seems to be fairly loosely defined as to how we measure a work rate.
And I think that feeds back into our first point on the clarity, is that if as a coach and team, we'll say if there's 2 or 3 of you or 4 of you together and the analyst, and if you guys can't walk out of a room knowing exactly how you're defining work rate, what hope have you got 30 players being on the same page as you if the 4 or 5 of you can't come out of it? And the challenge for us, I think, as coaches and analysts is get that clarity amongst the coaching team first. Then bring the players in. They're going to have opinions and you've got to listen to their opinions and they can add to that conversation brilliantly. But that clarity is so important no matter what it is. And I might even give, just before we finish up, the simplest version of that is, and I use this example widely and a lot of people have heard me probably use it, is this idea of a wide. If I play a ball in to you at full forward and it just goes over your head but goes over the end line, is that a wide, yes or no? 50% of people will say yes, 50% of people will say no because you weren't shooting, so it's not a wide. It doesn't matter whether we count it as a wide or not, so long as all the players know it is or it isn't. Because then if you're using numbers and you're using stats and a player gets it and he sees he had 5 wides, in his head he only took 4 shots, or he took 4 shots, had 3 scores and 1 wide, but you've counted this as a wide, then the trust is gone. Then the whole meaning of what this analysis, because if you got that wrong for that player, sure, everything else you've done could be wrong as well. So it's that clarity, and that's a simple version of it, let alone going on to what you're talking about and work rate and that side of things. So as a coaching group and an analyst, I think that's where the clarity comes together. Anything else you want to add in, Kevin, before we?
Not at all, Colin. I think we've covered quite a bit in that period of time there.
Just to summarise, again, we finished there with the clarity. Again, a key for me personally, if you're going to measure something, it has to be something that can be actionable afterwards, that you can either make decisions live in the game, otherwise you're collecting it for a nice to have, or as importantly, will it affect your next training? If you've got the detail, you've got the what happened, you've got the why it happened, now you can put into practice in that session on a Tuesday night or Wednesday night in order to try and improve it for the following week. And then the other one is, as a group, try and figure out what's important for you as a team. If you could only measure one thing, what would it be? Then if you can do that, look at what's the second thing that will be most important. Can you do both? Can you get the third? Can you get the fourth? And stop when the reliability and the action, if it's not actionable, it's not clear, there's no clarity, stick to those 2 or 3 and do them well, and then trust yourselves as a coaching team. You're the most, you're the eyes, you're the video initially of what's happening. So again, take that on board as well of how it's going. So that'd be my final thoughts. Kev, anything?
I think my final thoughts are just referring back to that point I made about the, what actions are we taking on the pitch, and are we reactive to a single snapshot, and that, making sure that we might have to react to one number within our stats on a Tuesday or a Monday or whatever night we're training. Right, that's going to be our focus, but also not losing sight of the long term. Losing sight over the course of the year, if you set yourselves a target, going back to our earlier example of the shot success, making sure that we're keeping an eye on that from session to session as well, and not expecting, fantastic results from one session, knowing that it does take time to impact any sort of improvement on something. So I think that's where the profiling comes in. You need to look at the profile to see what is the 1 or 2 key numbers we really need to work on. The example still on the screen, you might have a horrible day from the point of view of turnovers, but it's not actually that big a deal because it was a one-off match. The longer term thing might still be our shot success there, and we might still need to emphasize that. So it's not getting drawn into the reactive thing on the one match, and it's trying to look at the longer term picture.
Brilliant. That's us finished. Just want to thank James for inviting us on this evening. Myself and Kevin, as you can see, when it comes to coaching and analysis, you could see us. You could leave us talk all night. So we'll park it there for you, and we won't drag you out too long. So James, thank you very much for the invite.
Thanks, Colin.
And best of luck to everyone in the championships coming up, and wish you all good luck. So thanks for having us.
Thanks, Colm, and thank you to both Colm and Kevin for that very informative session. Some brilliant stuff that can be translated to the pitch and will be very helpful to people over the next couple of months. This session draws to a close the Be Ready to Play series in association with UPMC. Please remember to keep an eye out on the GAA, Camogie and LGFA social media and websites for more information on the Be Ready to Play series. Thank you and slán.